All right, Keith, since we last chatted, a lot has happened in the tech world. Google acquired Nest, spent 3.2 billion plus. Facebook spent about 10% of their company. I guess market value of that is around 20 billion. And then a lot of people have just been wondering, what is Apple doing? So can you kind of unpack for us how larger tech company thinks about acquisitions, maybe those three companies, what the strategies are, and maybe what the debate is around, people saying, there's a strain of people saying Apple knows exactly what they're doing, and there's another strain of saying, hey, they should start acquiring companies and preparing for the future.
Sure. So I think different large technology companies have clearly different strategies and are starting to use the resources differently. So for example, you can see Google over the last 10 years has been incredibly acquisitive. They've bought tons of companies, both large and small, from acqui-hires to the very expensive billion-dollar plus acquisitions where they've probably had 3 to 5 of those alone. Facebook has made both large and small acquisitions, acqui-hires all the time, as well as some very large acquisitions, 2 very prominent ones. And Apple generally buys smaller, technology-oriented companies or very specific talent, but isn't generally in the pure acqui-hire market and almost never buys a very expensive company as an entity. Apple's concerns are valid. They believe they have a special culture, a unique way of doing things that they leverage, a unique way of organizing things, uniquely confidential, secretive culture, creative, different design processes, and that bringing a scalable sort of foreign body into the organization might jeopardize the entire thing. Although they have actually, ironically, the biggest financial leverage. So Apple mints by far more cash than Facebook and Google combined. I believe Apple's profits are greater than Google's revenues. So they have the greatest financial resources to actually acquire talent, teams, companies, entities, and arguably they should be using that. A source of leverage, a source of power that a large company has is the cash flow to buy things and to fuel new innovation or to take innovation off the table or to strategically defend oneself. You can think of, for example, Google famously bought YouTube partially in a defensive maneuver. People could see that YouTube was generating a lot of searches, and that if someone wanted to compete with Google, the asset where people were searching for content frequently, addictively, all of the time, in the hands of somebody else, whether it was Yahoo or potentially Microsoft or even Facebook, would have been very dangerous to Google's core value proposition. Now, they have turned it eventually in enough time into a monetizable machine that's actually another revenue stream that's actually producing real value, but it probably was designed, at least in part, as a defensive acquisition. Facebook has made 2 strategic acquisitions, as well as several leadership-oriented acquisitions. So where I believe Mark sees a potential product leader running a company that's not thriving, he's actually made and generated and spiked acquisitions designed to place key lieutenants within the organization. So it's been a talent pool, generally speaking, with 2 outliers. The 2 large outliers being WhatsApp and Instagram. Instagram being extremely threatening to the core of Facebook, a clearly brilliant acquisition by any metric, certainly motivated mostly defensively, whereas WhatsApp is a little bit more debatable, both in terms of the price, the strategic value, the long-term value, but certainly a very risk-adjusted, well, certainly a risky bet.
Were you, on the WhatsApp acquisition, were you surprised by the structure of it and the fair market value at the time of the transaction?
Well, valuations are kind of a separate topic that we could spend a lot of time on. Valuations are really not some objective metric. Really what a valuation and acquisition is what's the price that motivates the buyer and the seller, that motivates the seller to sell. So it's a function of supply and demand. If a seller really doesn't want to sell, you have to pay a very high premium so that the seller is motivated. That's really what drives a lot of these acquisitions. It's not as if there's a discounted cash flow model at some spreadsheet that some banker has manufactured in many of these acquisitions, particularly those that are pre-revenue or pre-substantial revenue, where they're not being bought as a business unit, which is more what you see in the enterprise sales world. People are buying business units and then hoping that their sales and distribution channels will amplify the revenue.
But given that dynamic and maybe there was a back and forth between WhatsApp and Facebook, were you surprised by the amount that Zuckerberg was willing to concede?
Oh, absolutely. 10% of anybody's market cap is a substantial bet. The $1 billion bet wasn't actually that big a bet, or the $1.5 billion YouTube acquisition is a rounding error in the daily trading volume, market fluctuations for Google market cap. Anytime you can buy a strategic asset for less than the fluctuations in your daily market cap, it's obviously a wise thing to do. So I think that Google's been very strategic. Android was an incredibly valuable acquisition as well. I mean, you could think about, in kind of a hypothetical thought experiment, what would you believe about the future of Google today if they didn't own Android? And I think many people would think that they were sort of like Yahoo, passage prime, dying, slow death, aging as the mobile transformation was taking place underneath them. But because they control one of the two operating systems in the world that matter, they actually have a very vibrant future, and it's reflected in their market cap. And that was done primarily through an acquisition. So that's just proof of the value of acquisitions. Where Apple, in the last year, has made a lot of acquisitions by historical standards. I believe it's been reported they acquired 15 or 16 companies, which is plus or minus the entire total that have been acquired in Tim Cook's entire career at Apple. So you can see a transformation going on, even if it's not on the same core strategic approach, or you're adopting the same core strategic approach as Apple, Facebook. The debate in the ecosystem that we were talking about recently that evolved on Twitter is there probably are some assets at the strategic data and services layer that some people, if they were running Apple, would have purchased. Because if you're minting so much cash, rather than dividend it back to your shareholders, there are things like Twitter or WhatsApp or whatever the case may be that have a 10 to 50% chance of actually helping Apple.
I always thought, pedestrian opinion, that they should have bought Instagram. And I want to talk about that later, but they should have also bought Waze because they have a maps problem, and this is the orthogonal, potentially orthogonal solution to that.
Yeah, I don't know if Waze would have been a perfect solution to the maps issues. It would have been a nice complement, and certainly a community with interesting data, arguably very unique data, would have been a value proposition you could have layered on top of a maps product. So one of the things you're always seeking to do is how do you differentiate? How do you differentiate vis-a-vis the competitors you care about in a way that has long-term value proposition creation? And so if you have a unique supplier of data, being able to tie that to your operating system makes it more likely users will buy your operating system and can't live without your operating system. Whereas if you just have a services layer and you're just competing on the basis of one service versus another, that may or may not be that attractive. But you can imagine buying some of the more popular applications and making them work better on your platform. And if users are addicted to that experience, they may decide to buy an iPhone instead of an Android device. And that's the level of competition. That's the next level of competition. And I'm not sure that Apple's purchased anything yet that would qualify in that sector. But you can imagine the Dropboxes of the world, the Evernotes of the world. These are just theoretical thought experiments. The Instagrams of the world. What products and services could you buy and make them native to your own platform so that they work better? And so that users at the end of the day are more willing to buy your phone and your device versus other, more commoditized devices.
And that may be the way they're going with like Bluetooth LE and M7 chips and sort of changing the hardware game. Right?
It is. They're changing the hardware game, and that's more of a fundamental core DNA. It's the standard Apple playbook. And I think, for example, if there is a watch-like product, that will magnify some of Apple's strengths. It's very difficult from a hardware design, from using the product correctly to make it work within the constraints of a hand, so that it doesn't break, so it doesn't snap, so that it's waterproof, bloodproof, all of the kinds of things that push the envelope of science and engineering. That's where Apple competes the best, pushing the envelope. Once things become well understood and they can be reversed engineered by just a competent organization, Apple loses some of that competitive advantage. And you can argue that the phones in the device world have been dumbed down enough so that just competent organizations at hardware and software can compete, so that Apple needs to push the envelope in a new area where the hardware and software engineering is like truly world-class and just at the point of impossible. And that's where Apple thrives, just at the point of impossible.